Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending upon where you are today. I'm just going to move on to this slide, just as a quick reminder of the dates for the remaining two sessions in this webinar series. The next session looks at using switches away from the computer, and actually it's probably my favourite session because we'll be talking about lots and lots of interesting and fun activities that we can do, which don't involve having to plug things into the computer. So today we're going to move on from the last session. The last session looked at experiential learning and learners who are at a cause and effect level, and how we would use switches with that particular group of students. We want to extend that today, and we'll be looking at early scanning and doing that with one or two switches, depending upon the needs of the student. The very best handout that I can suggest that you get for this session is a document called the Switch Progression Roadmap. It's a document that I wrote when I was working with inclusive technology. At the end of the session, there'll be a link there which you can follow to download a free copy of that booklet. There's one other slide which is probably worth mentioning. At this level, we use quite a fair bit of software, so I'll be talking and mentioning bits of software. The last but one slide in this series is a software list. So everything that I mention at all of the various stages, there will be a list of all of that software there. And if anybody has any specific questions, I'll be happy to answer them at the end. Okay. So when we're using switches with students, we need to be very clear about what it is that we want to achieve. Right from the very beginning, I think we need to, if we're going to use a switch with a child, we need to use it for a purpose, and that purpose is always giving a person independence, giving them the skills to be able to make meaningful choices independently. And that's the ultimate goal. That's where we aim to get to. It's not enough that we just use a switch. I've visited many schools and see children using switches at a cause and effect level, and using activities that I created on the Priory Woods website 9 years ago, and they're still using them. We need to be very careful that we have high expectations for our students, and that we do set achievable targets and be prepared to move them on. So, the first thing we need to be absolutely sure of is that the students actually got cause and effect. I'm waiting for my slide coming up. Oh gosh, heavens, sorry. Well, that's the first time it's ever gone wrong, so. We need to be absolutely sure that the student we're working with does have a clear understanding of cause and effect. It sounds silly, it sounds like one of those things that, I'm looking at this child, they're pressing a switch, something's happening on the computer, they're looking at it, vis-a-vis, that person has cause and effect. It's not quite so simple as that. I think because of the importance of it, it's worth mentioning again. What we need to see with children who are using switches at a cause and effect level is that they actually understand the relationship between pressing the switch and what's happening on the screen, or what the toy is doing, or what the light's coming on, or whatever appliance it is that we're using with the switch. And the child actually has an understanding that they're doing it. If they don't, then really everything that we do after that really won't be as effective. We need to be absolutely sure that the person that we're working with understands that they're making that happen. So at this level, I always say, generalize. It's not good enough to be able to look at a child and say, yes, they're pressing a switch on a computer, they must understand cause and effect. I like to make sure that the child has generalized that skill across a range of different contexts. So I'd like to see the child using the switch perhaps with a power link to turn on a fan or some lighting effect or something, using a switch with battery toys to control and play and operate those as well, using Big Macs around a classroom. I'd like to see that cause and effect concept generalised. I've written on my slide there, Big Macs are your best friends at this stage of learning. They certainly are. When it comes to using switches and embedding the use of switches into everything that we do in the classroom, a Big Mac's probably our most useful tool. I can't think of a single activity that I would do in a day teaching that I couldn't incorporate switch use into that with a Big Mac. And I'm sure that every single one of you that's joined us today would be able to think of lots and lots of activities where they could incorporate switch use into that. The only way to be absolutely sure is see the child demonstrate an understanding of cause and effect in a range of different contexts. That means observing the child, making simple notes, and keeping those notes. When we're sure and when we're absolutely ready, we need to think about moving them on. And what usually tends to happen is we move them onto this stage called switch building. Anybody that knows me and anybody that's ever heard me speak anywhere knows that this is a very contentious issue with me. I find it difficult to understand sometimes why we use switch building and what its relevance is in terms of using a switch. When we first thought about using switches many years ago, it seemed that if a child could press a switch once to make something happen, and then we could extend that by the child having to press the switch 3 times to make something happen, that was some level of progression, that the child had actually made some progress in doing that. And that wasn't really what the aim was. I think at this level, the concept of pressing a switch a number of times isn't the fact that the child can press the switch 3 times or can press the switch 5 times. If that was a measure of success, and if a child was making progress by the number of times they could bang it, the children that we work with who bang switches, our switch tappers, by that maxim, they would all be geniuses. It's not. At this level, this concept of switch building is very much about completing a simple sequence. So in other words, I have to do something more than once in order for that to happen. But the key bit of that is not that I press the switch 3 times. The key bit is that I notice that something's changed every time I press the switch. There are lots of examples. We can press a switch to build pictures, which in some senses, some people might think that that's a valid thing. Assuming the child can understand what the picture is and can determine that they're building a picture of a cow because they've got a picture of a cow's udder on the screen, then there may be some value in that. Much better is to use activities where we're building scenes. So, for example, the example I've used on the slide is from a program called SenseSwitch. It's free. Google it. You can download it for free. And in that program, we build scenes. We press the switch once and we'll get a field. We press the switch again, we get some trees. We press the switch the 3rd time and we'll get a tractor. And when we press it again, the scene will animate and we're giving a reward for doing that. We could do it with stories. We can create a series of very simple storybooks, and the child presses the switch and it goes through each page of the story. We're pointing out the changes. We're engaging the child with what's happening. Look, what can we see? It's our school bus. Where are we going to go? Oh, we're going to the seaside. And what we're going to do when we get there? We're going to paddle in the ocean. And that's a much better way of doing it. You can do that too with communication devices as a way of taking it away from the computer. Step-by-step devices are great for that. You can create a very simple sequence with a reward at the end. The most obvious one that I can think of right now is a sneeze. So we could do chew, 4 presses and a nice reward at the end. So if we're going to do this switch building level, be aware of the reasons why we're doing it, that it's not about how many times the person can bang the switch or how many times they can press it. And it's very much about the person noticing those changes, realizing that something has changed on the screen. The reason for that, and certainly part of the reason for that, is what we're doing is modeling what a person might need to do in order to make a choice with a switch. If you imagine we're using a move switch in 2 switches. I'd have to press that switch a number of times to get to where I wanted to be. But I need to watch the screen to make sure that I was following what was happening on the screen. And that's kind of where this skill fits in. Do it in lots of different circumstances, use different computer software, create different stories. Stories are certainly the single best way to work at this level. And use it step by step and make sure that the person really understands and engages with the screen or whatever's happening between each key press. When we're sure about that and we're happy with that, then we can move on to thinking about a little bit more about scanning. I'm going to split this up into 2 sections almost. The first section will very much be about single switch scanning, and the second session 2 switch scanning, because initially they're 2 different skill sets that we need to work on. With 1 switch scanning, by and large, what will happen is the computer will cycle through a series of options. For example, a bus, a car, a train, and the student will press their single switch when the one that they want is highlighted, and that highlight will be via a red box or a coloured box around the object that they want, and sometimes it'll be announced through auditory prompting. So there are 2 skills there. The first one is timing skill, and that means being able to press the switch in response to something. So when somebody says truck and I want a truck, I press the switch then. And the second one's the tracking skill, and that's being able to watch something move across the screen and press that switch when it's in the right place. So almost a kind of target and tracking skill. And we need to work on both of them. Both of them are intrinsic to being able to scan with a single switch. There are, however, a group of students for whom this level will be very, very problematic. And it's very unfortunate that the people who need this level are usually the people who find it most difficult. If a person can only use 1 switch because, for example, they have quite profound cerebral palsy, and we've only managed to find 1 switch move, one particular body movement that person can use to access a switch, and then we present them with an activity where there's a level of anticipation. I'm waiting for something to happen, and then something happens on the screen and I've got to respond to it. The typical response from the person with cerebral palsy is often that they go into spasm, or they get a little bit, their kind of arms start shaking, and they can't quite coordinate in time in order to be able to press the switch. So we do need to be quite careful when we're thinking about timing and tracking skills, and make sure that we're aware of the particular needs of the student that we're working with. A lot of software you'll find will have quite a short time for the person to respond, and often it's not long enough for people who have cerebral palsy. So we do need to be quite creative in the way that we apply that. Let's look at the first skill, and that's the timing skill. This is often described as pop-up. And effectively what happens is I look at the screen, and the screen could be blank, and after a random period of time something will pop up on the screen. When I see that, I need to press the switch in response to that. I've showed a little example on the top of the screen of a football game. There's a soccer player, sorry for our colleagues in the US, in a goal mouth. A ball will pop up on the screen. When the student sees the ball, they press the switch, and the ball will be kicked towards the goal, and the goalkeeper will either catch the ball or not. Pop-up activities are really useful, but as I mentioned earlier, they're quite challenging for people who have cerebral palsy, so we do need to be very careful. If you're going to use software, go into the options and have a look in the options for timing. There's usually a set of options which will allow you to change the amount of time the object's on the screen. So in other words, how long the child would have in order to respond to the object popping up on the screen. For some children, that period be quite short, but for others it needs to be very long. And for some, the activity, the software doesn't need to move on until the child's pressed the switch. Certainly some of the newer software that we're seeing allows for that to happen. Something will pop up on the screen and it will stay there until the person has actually got their hand to the switch, coordinated their movements and pressed the switch in order to respond to it. So newer software will do that. You can, of course, create your own pop-up activities. And I put a little picture of Wally there. And you guys in the States, I think they call him Waldorf in the States. I'm not really sure. But we can create an activity, a very simple pop-up activity that we can use, and we can adjust the timing ourselves. So, for example, if we use something like PowerPoint or Switcher Maker, and we put some pictures, 5 or 6 pictures in there of the children in the class, and one picture in there of Wally, we can go through and change the pictures for the child, and when the child sees Wally, he can press his Big Mac and say, "I found Wally." And it's exactly the same skill. However, we're able to control the timing. I can wait for as long as the child needs before I move on to the next slide. So, pop-up, really important skill, and quite a change really from where we've been before. Up until now, the child's been in control. In essence, they press the switch to make something happen. At this level, they're pressing the switch in response to something happening. So we need to make sure that we're engaging the child with the screen. They're actually looking at the screen and waiting and anticipating that popping up. I'm quite conscious of the fact I'm using the word child, and I do apologise. When we're talking about switch use, it could just as easily be an adult who's learning to use a switch. So if I do slip into child, that's largely fueled by my background of teaching younger children. The second part of that skill set is the targeting element, and this is a little bit more difficult to kind of explain without being able to show you the software really. In this level and at this stage, what we're hoping to do is for the child to press a switch when something's in the right place. And the example I've shown again is from the program Send Switcher, which is free, and you can download it. I know I've said that already, but it's worth mentioning twice. And in this example, a car will move across the screen, and just before the car's about to fall into the hole, the child would press the switch and the car would jump across. In other examples, there's some Olympic hurdlers, and they're running along the track, and they come to a hurdle, they press the switch, and would jump the hurdle. If the switch isn't pressed in time, the hurdler would trip over and fall. So it's about tracking the object across the screen. So looking, identifying what it is that we need to track, and following it as it moves across the screen. And when it's in the right position, we can press the switch. There is very, very little software which address this particular level, and it's really only in the last couple of years that people have actually thought about how we might teach this skill, and actually whether we need to teach this skill at all. By and large, when we were using switches, we kind of got to cause and effect. And the next thing we did was, certainly in the UK, we would use clicker. Maybe in the States we would use IntelliTools, and we would create scanning activities for people. And often there was too big of a cognitive leap for some of our students, certainly our students with intellectual disabilities, being able to break this down into smaller steps. So the pop-up activity and the targeting activity as two separate activities that we can work on. I say separate. We should actually be teaching them side by side, because they're two skills that people would need. And I think when you look at the booklet that I mentioned earlier, you'll see that it's not laid down as any particular, you must do this, then this, then this, then this. there is a series of activities in there at different levels, starting at experiential, ending at an independent person who can choose independently using scanning. And the hope would be that you would assess the students' capabilities based on those key milestones and small steps, and then be able to set targets. And those targets would cover both the pop-up skill and the targeting skill, and you would do a range of both. You can make tracking activities for off the computer use as well. You'll see on my slide I've got a picture of Britney Spears. This is not my proudest moment, I must say. We created a very, very simple activity that worked on position. We gave the child a Big Mac, and on the Big Mac was some music, and the music was from Britney Spears. I'm sure you remember the song, "Oh Baby Baby." And the target, we put a nice big red circles around the floor of the classroom, and I walked around the classroom, and if I stood on one of the red circles, and my student pressed the Big Mac and brought some Britney Spears music, I would have to dance like Britney Spears. And I have to say that compared to some of the things that we were doing on the computer, the child I was working with was much, much more motivated to have me dance like Britney Spears than have cars jump over lakes or hurdlers fall over flat on their face. So be creative in what you're doing with this at this level. There are lots of opportunities to do things away from the computer. You don't have to do the Britney Spears thing, but it certainly worked for the student that I was working with. So just to sum up then, at this level, we're working with one switch, and we're starting to introduce the concept of scanning with a single switch. We're going to work on two separate skill levels, a pop-up skill level, so in other words, responding to something that's happening on the screen. So something pops up on the screen, I press the switch when I see it, and I'm given a reward for doing that. The second skill is the tracking and targeting skill. I need to track something as it moves across the screen. When it's in a particular place, as in the example on there, the net is going to catch a fish. I press the switch, and I'm given a reward for pressing that switch. What we're doing there is actually modelling, again, some of the skills that we'll need if we're going to use a computer with one switch to make choices by scanning. What will happen with one switch is the computer will move something across the screen, usually a red box, and it will announce the choices that I've got. I need to track that red box as it moves across the screen, and I also need the ability to press the switch at the right time when it's on the choice that I want to make. And both of those two things are addressed in these two skill areas. When we've got to that level and our students are comfortable and confident in this type of activity, then we can move them on to more traditional, more formal scanning activities. I'll come to more formal scanning activities towards the end of the session. We'll move now to two switches and look at some of the skills we'll need in order to be able to make choices using two switches. The first thing I'd say is that I think pretty much everybody should get access to two switches, irrespective of whether they're using one switch or whether we've decided they're going to use one switch or two switches. As somebody moves out of the cause and effect level, I like to add breadth by introducing an additional switch, and that may well be for a separate activity. I may have a story with some pictures, and one switch will move through some pictures, and the child will choose a picture, and then I'll give them another switch, and that picture will then animate or play some music or show a video or something else. I like to give them two switches with two separate cause and effect activities, where I can press a switch to, in the example on the screen, to make the rocket on the left fire up into space, or the rocket on the right fire into space. I can use two switches with a power link, one perhaps to turn music on, another to put disco lights, and so I can make my own disco. But giving people an opportunity, really, in essence, just to play with switches, really, and have some fun with pressing them, and just experience using two switches. I've written be careful about questioning, and I think this is quite important when we use two switches with two separate cause and effect activities. That I mentioned earlier, this is about experimenting with two switches and having experience of that. We need to be careful that we don't start asking questions too soon. So if a child has two switches and one puts the music on and one puts the lights on, if I start asking the child to find the one that provides the music straight away, it increases the cognitive difficulty of the activity. Initially, it's just about them exploring those switches and seeing what they do. Once they become more confident with that, then I can start to ask questions and add in an additional level of cognition there. So with two switches, introduce two switches. Even if you have to hold one and offer one for the second one, do it, because it's certainly worthwhile. And don't restrict yourself to the computer. Often when we get to two switches, people suddenly think that the only thing we can use is computer software. That's not true. We can create lots and lots of activities. I could think of 100 activities that we can do with two Big Macs or an iTalk 2. Another 100 activities we could do with two appliances plugged into the power link, and activities where we're using toys. The multi-sensory room too. I'm not sure how I've forgotten the word I was going to say. The multi-sensory room, certainly in the UK, I'm not sure how they're described in the US, but certainly is one of the single best areas for exploring the use of more than one switch. In the olden days, we used to call it building an environment. I would press one switch and turn something on, and press another one to turn that on, and press one again to do something else. So use everything you've got. Again, we want to make sure that the concept of two switches doing different things will be generalized, and the child will have a good, clear, solid understanding of that before we start to move them on to something else. The something else being learning that the switch can have two functions. So each switch does something different. So the title I've used for the slide is One Activity, Two Functions. And by that I mean we have a single activity, and one switch does one thing and another switch does another. For example, the example I've got there on the slide is building a stack of tin cans. So with one switch, I'll build up my stack, and when I press the second switch, I'll knock it down again. And it doesn't matter when I press the switch. I can press either switch at any time. If there's no cans to be knocked down, I press the second switch. He'll swing his hammer, but nothing will happen. I won't get a reward. If I press build the cans up and I put two cans there and press it, I'll get a little reward. If I put 4 cans there or 5 cans there and press it, I'll get a bigger reward. So I have two switches and one single activity. There's a music activity there as well. I've shown a music switch, adaptive music player. And in that example, with the switches work, one switch would change the track and the other switch would play the music. I'll come back to your question in a second, Dan. I just want to finish this bit of the slide here. There's very, very, very little software that addresses this idea of one activity, two functions. So you do need to be creative. So use what you've got around the classroom. PowerLink's great for this, so we can create an activity with two separate things. We can certainly do that with by linking things like a Big Mac to a toy. The obvious example that I'm thinking of might be something like we would have some Lego bricks, and on the Big Mac I would have another brick, please. I press the switch, and every time I press the Big Mac, it asks for another brick, and somebody will build up a tower of bricks. And when I press the other switch, my pig starts to walk and knocks over the tower of bricks. So two separate functions, one activity, building a tower, and knocking that over. Now it's really important that we learn this because if we're going to use two switches for scanning, it will be this is a very, very important skill to remember that one switch will do kind of move, and the other will choose something. So effectively, we're modelling that one switch is building something up, and the other switch is knocking it down. One switch is moving through our choices, and the other switch is choosing them, which leads us quite nicely into the next part of this skill, which is called move and choose, or move and get. I'm just waiting for my slide to update. Oh, it's not going to update, I don't think.
Ian, did you want to answer the question?
Oh, right, yeah, sure, yeah.
Ian, before we move, okay.
Yeah, sure. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So the question was, are these the same switches that we're using? We've kind of addressed the idea of which switch to use in our previous session, and Mary will be able to give you a link to the recording of that session. We talked in that session really about choosing a switch for a child or for a student. By and large, 90% of the people that we work with will be fine with a big switch, a big red switch, big red twist, I think, that big twist switch they're called these days. Large target area and a coloured top, which is the child can actually see and differentiate from the background colour of the desk. So something the child can see and are able to press with. Often with some children, and certainly when we're using one switch with people with quite complex movement problems, we might need to use something quite special. But one would hope that we'd have that in place before we get to this point, really. So we would have decided on what switch we were going to use at an earlier cause and effect level, and the student would have had lots of opportunities to practice using that switch before we got to this point. So the answer to your question is yes, it would be the same switch. We would have if we were using two switches, those two switches we would have decided upon quite early on. And if the child does have complex movement difficulties, the decision about which switch will have been informed by somebody like the people who are in our webinar today, AT specialists who may have come in and done that assessment for the child. I would always recommend that if you're working with a child and you've got a child in your class and you're not sure what to connect up, what switch will be the right thing, take advice from people, and those people would be professional people like the AT specialists we've got today. They would be other colleagues in school. They would be occupational therapist colleagues, speech and language therapy colleagues, physiotherapy colleagues, and parents, of course. The more information we can pull together about how the student moves, how the student interacts with things around them, would be the better the decision we can make in terms of which switch to use. And I'll just say this because it's always something that is always in the back of my mind. Just remember that there are some people out there that, despite our very best efforts, are not going to be able to press the switch. And you shouldn't go home and beat yourself up because of that. Without using the switch, often the child will have already developed some other ways of interacting with you, whether that's eye pointing or gesture or vocalizing. Use those and revisit it a little bit later. Don't spend forever trying to find a switch position that might not be there at the moment. I suppose the last thing to mention about switches as well is that things change. That you might find the perfect switch position, and then next week it's not there, and it doesn't work properly, and the child can't press the switch in the same way. And there are lots of influencing factors. The most common, I suppose, is just medication. Certainly I don't know what the medication, names of the medication in the US, but in the UK, lots of children with cerebral palsy will take a muscle relaxant drug, which baclofen, which affects muscle tone. Too little, and the child will be locked up solid, and too much, and the child will have very, very poor muscle tone and be unable to really move their arms particularly very well. So things change, and be prepared to change along with it. Okay, back to where we were then. So we've now got two switches, and we've kind of learned that one switch can do one thing and another switch can do another thing. We then can move on to introduce the concept that one switch is our move switch, and the second switch is our choose switch. So in the example I've got on my slide, I've got a crocodile and a sneaker, or a training shoe as we call them in the UK. And if I press my move switch, the shoe will move closer and closer to the crocodile's mouth. If I press my choose switch, the crocodile's mouth will open and close. He'll snap. If I put the shoe into the crocodile's mouth and press my choose switch, I get a huge reward. If it's not in his mouth, I don't get any reward. So by using that piece of software, I learn that this switch moves something and moves it into a place where, if I press my choose switch, I'll get a reward, which is effectively modelling what happens when we scan. We press the switch to move through our choices, and we press the choose switch in order to be able to activate and choose that thing that we want and get the reward, or whatever it is that we're choosing for. Move and choose is a really, really important thing to learn. Again, there's very, very little software at this level that doesn't involve formal scanning. When I talk about formal scanning, I mean using scan boxes and traditionally scanning through objects, where it's a lot of fun. This particular piece of software is from a piece of software called Switch Skills for 2, Set 2, the best name for one piece of software ever. And I think it's from Inclusive TLC in the US and Inclusive in the UK. And it has a whole series of activities at this level which are designed to work with one switch moving something and one switch selecting something. At the earliest levels in this program, if I press the switch 4 or 5 times, that shoe will get to the crocodile's mouth and it won't move any further. At the hardest levels, if I keep pressing the move switch, it will move into the crocodile's mouth and then move out of it again. So I need to know when to press the choose switch, when it's absolutely in the right place. Once we've covered these two areas, pretty much we should be in a position where we can start to think about introducing more formal scanning. So just to kind of sum up with two switches, we've presented the child with two switches, and initially we've connected them to two separate cause and effect activities. I press this, that rocket goes off. I press that, something else happened. I press this, I get a dancing hippopotamus. I press this, I get a farting dinosaur. Two separate cause and effect activities. Then we've moved them on to using those two switches to interact with a single activity. So I press this switch, it moves through my tracks, and I press the choose switch to listen to the music that I want to use. And then finally, we've reinforced the idea of move and choose. So I press one switch, the move switch, to move through my choices, and I press the choose switch to select them. You can imagine how you could create activities, and certainly at the end of the session, when I talk about the software, I'll mention the importance of open framework software. At this level, a really, really useful tool is to use things like Switch It Maker. I can create in Switch It Maker, I can put into Switch It Maker 6 different videos and set it to work with two switches. So I press my move switch and I'll see a picture of Britney Spears. I press it again, I'll see a picture of Elvis Presley. I press it again, I see a picture of Justin Bieber. And if I want to watch Justin Bieber's video, I press my choose switch. And the choose switch will then trigger the video of Justin Bieber. And again, it's going through this idea of the move switch moving through my choices, choose switch selecting them. If we got that, and the students that we're working with have got a good understanding of that, we've seen that generalised across a whole range of different activities, we can then move them on to scanning and more formal scanning. I'm going to just kind of do a kind of brief background to scanning, largely because not everybody, I'm sure looking at our audience, everybody here does understand scanning, but for those people that don't, scanning involves having a number of things on the screen, usually in a row, left to right row, and depending upon whether we're using one or two switches, those objects on the screen will be highlighted one at a time. So in the example on my screen, I've got a bottle of milk, a can of Mountain Dew, and a can of Coca-Cola, and I've got a highlighting box, a scan box. That scan box will move from the milk to the Mountain Dew to the Coca-Cola and back to the milk again. And if I wanted to choose the milk, I would press the switch when the scan box is on the milk. Good software, certainly most switch software, would have auditory prompting as well. So the computer would say milk and then move to the next one, Mountain Dew, or move to the next one, Coca-Cola. And whichever one I press on, that's the one I would get, and that would be me making my choices. We can do this kind of thing with away from the computer too. I know that AbleNet have a communication device called the Flash with a 4 instead of an A, and that has a special built-in learning to scan mode, which I'll talk about a little bit more when we get into choosing specific objects. But so you don't have to necessarily attach yourself specifically to using this with computer software. A lovely way to do it would be to have Britney Spears, Justin Bieber, and Bob the Builder, and to whichever one the child chose, you had to sing a song, one of their songs. This concept of a scan box, however, is quite an abstract thing, and usually the first time children or students see it is on a computer screen. And a long time ago, I was speaking to a colleague, and he told me that he actually made a scan box. He cut it out of red card and cut the hole in the middle, and he used that, certainly with his students who he knew would be using scanning as their way of interacting with choice decision making. And he would use that during meal times and break times. So, for example, he'd have on the table a drink of a chocolate biscuit, a cake, or an apple, and he'd hold the box over the chocolate biscuit and he'd say, would you like a chocolate biscuit? Would you like a cake? And hold the box over the cake. Or would you like an apple? And hold the box over the apple. And the child would choose whichever by whatever means that they did. But just having that process as part of the kind of choosing methods before they see it on the computer helps the child to associate that box with choosing, and it's very, very, very worthwhile doing. So if you think you've got a child and you're going to move into this area of formal scanning, do cut out a cardboard scan box and introduce it. You can change the colour of scan boxes too. So you know, if the student particularly there was a particular reason why he didn't want to use red. I'm thinking sometimes with green backgrounds and the issues with colour blindness, we might want to change that colour. You can do that too. So moving into proper scanning then, formal scanning, the first place we kind of find ourselves usually is in what we call errorless scanning. Errorless scanning is where I get to go through that process, so 3 things on the screen, each highlighted in turn, and I can select any of them, and it doesn't matter which one I select, I'll always get a reward for doing it. I forgot to mention something on the previous slide. I mentioned scanning, and I forgot to mention the differences between scanning with 1 switch and scanning with 2 switches. So if I'm scanning with 1 switch, if you look at that top screen where we've got a picture of Yankee Doodle, there are 3 objects underneath the screen, a digger, a broomstick, and a train. If I'm using this with 1 switch, the computer will move the scan box between each of those objects, We tell the computer how quickly to do that, so the child has enough time to understand what the computer's saying and be able to process and press the switch if they want to. So, for example, in that example, the computer would say a digger, and it would wait a few seconds. It would then highlight the broomstick and would say a broomstick, and it would wait a few seconds, highlight the train and say a train. And the child with one switch would press the switch on whichever of those that they wanted to choose. And in that activity, it's a storytelling activity. Whichever one they choose, it will add that element to the story. For a two-switch user, remember they have a move switch and a choose switch. If they press their move switch, it will move between the three choices on the screen. So the first time they press it, it'll say truck, digger. Second time, broomstick. Third time, train, and back to the beginning again. So every time they press it, it will move the highlighting box and pressing the button to make that choice. So the process is exactly the same. It's the concept is exactly the same. It's just the process that's slightly different. For one switch user, the computer moves the choices, and for a two-switch user, they're in control of how we move through the options. Errorless scanning means exactly that. You can't get it wrong. Whatever you choose, something happens, and it's an ideal way to introduce it. The two examples I've shown there both have three things on the screen, and I think that's quite important. Whatever you do, try not to do it with two. Two is never really a choice. I think three is much, much better when we start that. The piece of software on the top is Choose and Tell. It tells a story. Yankee Doodle wanted to go on an adventure. What should he go on? And the child would choose to go in a digger, to go on a magic broomstick, or to go in a train. And whichever one he chooses, that would happen. The example below that, the example below that is from Slideshow Maker. We've created three very, very different musical slideshows, and each one will be scanned in turn. So the first one would say cars, the second one dogs, and the next one the planets. And whichever one the child pressed the switch on, that would be the one that would play. So errorless scanning, very, very, very easy way to introduce scanning. Wherever the child presses the switch, they'll get it. They can't get it wrong, and something will always happen. We can, at this point, introduce some questioning too. I wouldn't do it right from the very beginning. I'd do it a little bit later. But once we start to see a child getting a good understanding of this, I'd be inclined to say, I wonder what the digger does, or I wonder what would happen if he went on the broomstick, and encourage a child to choose a specific thing, which then leads us into the next part of that skill, which is choosing specific objects. I'm just waiting for my slide to update, sorry. When we choose specific objects, by and large what's happening is we're asking the child a particular question. So in the example I've got on the screen, find a digger. And rather than having every box filled with lots of things to choose from, we simplify it by using empty boxes. So in the instance I've got up there, if that was being scanned by the computer, the auditory prompting would say, on the first box, there's nothing here. On the next box, a digger, and the third box, nothing here. So the child has to attend to the screen, look, listen to what's happening, and then move through their choices either automatically with one switch or by pressing their move switch with two switches until they're on the object that they want to select and press the switch to select it. Again, there's very little software at this level that does this. However, you can use software, open framework software like Choose It Maker 2 to very quickly create activities at this level where we're using empty cells and asking children specific questions. Certainly from my experience of teaching children in school, they absolutely love activities where we use pictures of them. So I'd introduce the activity by using a picture of them on a grid with 3 cells, 2 empty and a picture of them. So and the recorded prompts would be nobody here. Here's Stephen. Nobody here. And the question would be, can you find Stephen? And then I'd introduce other people in the class, or even pictures of parents or family friends, or things that the child's interested in. The very beauty of open framework software is it allows you to personalise that to things that we know the child's interested in. We talked in the last session really about motivation. We can give a child a switch, but we really, really need to give them a reason to press it. And for some children, certainly those children who have disengaged with technology, and we all know them, those children with cerebral palsy who tried and haven't really been able to make an effect very much. We really need to engage them with it, and we do that by giving them activities which really push their buttons, which, there's no reason why that couldn't be a picture of the cast of Glee, and when I press the switch, I get some music and a piece of video from Glee, or whatever it is that motivates a child. Using empty cells is great. This particular piece of software has lots of different levels of this. So empty cells first and one object. And in the next example, it's that you build a scene, and the scene's a farmyard. We have 4 animals in the grid, and every time a child chooses one of those animals, it introduces an empty grid. That then is emptied. So the auditory prompting would be a goat, a cow, nothing here, a horse, and the activity itself would become progressively more difficult. We use empty cells really because if they were full, it would make it more difficult, and we want to be absolutely sure that a child can identify the cell that they need and get themselves to it, either automatically through the one switch scanning, or by pressing their move and choose switches if they're using 2-switch scanning. Spend a fair bit of time on this and be absolutely sure that children have got it before we move them on And where do we move them to? Well, the end of the road, really. When we started these 2 seminars about switching, I talked about this being a journey almost, that all of the children, the students that we work with, would be somewhere on the continuum between being an experiential learner, so somebody who doesn't initiate, right through to somebody who's able to confidently scan. Mary, my internet has just dropped out. Can you just check that we're on independent choosing slide, please?
Sure. There you go.
I live in the wilds.
We're up.
So as long as if we've got that slide, that's fine. I'm able to
Everybody
see that.
can see it.
Yep, that's good. Okay, so we've actually, we're at the other end of the scale are people who can choose independently, and those are people who can use 1 or 2 switches to scan and make choices themselves. And those choices might be words in a word grid if we're using something like Clicker. They could also be symbols on a communication aid, a whole range of things. Effectively, what we've done is give people the skills to be able to make choices themselves independently. I've always described this whole process really as a journey, and I suppose that's a very good strong analogy for switch use. I like to kind of describe it, and I remember it mostly as my attempts to learn to drive. I'm sure that every single person that joined us today, somewhere along the line, has learned to drive. I can't see your screens, but I would ask you to put your hands up. And you all remember that moment when you got into the car and you sat there for the first time behind the steering wheel, and you look down and you've got pedals on the floor and a steering wheel and all manner of buttons and knobs and all manner of things, and your driving instructor tells you to move off, and you're looking at your feet and you're looking at the steering wheel and you're looking at the speedometer, and it's a million things to do, and occasionally you remember to look out of the windscreen to see where you're going, and it all seems horribly complicated and difficult. And then a few weeks down the line, suddenly you're able to forget about the steering wheel and forget about the pedals on the floor and forget about the buttons, all of that becomes automatic. It's almost as if we don't need to think about that anymore. And we start to think about, actually, well, where can I go in this car, and where will it take me, and what will I be able to do? And that's kind of a good analogy for switch use, really. When we first start a child with using switches, it's just like that first day in the car. There's a million things that are happening and a million things that I need to attend to, but very slowly the switch use itself becomes automatic. So certainly for somebody who's switch scanning, they're not thinking about pressing the move switch and the get switch. They're doing that because that part will become automatic, and we're able to do that. We need to remember too that if we use the analogy of learning to drive and and going on a journey, that we as educators actually have the roadmaps for how they'll get there, and we decide how interesting or not that journey is going to be. So, I'd certainly encourage you, if we're working with switch users, to be creative. You guys really are the most creative educators, the most creative people, because we have to be. We work with students, and we're by and large, certainly students with intellectual difficulties, we'll be working with them for a long, long time, and we may be teaching the same subjects for a long, long time. So be creative and make it fun for the students. We'll just go to the next slide then, Mary, if you could. And this is a list of software.
Yep. Here you are.
Oh, thank you. I'm back alive again. Thanks. This is a list of software that fits in with all of these particular stages that we've addressed through both of the sessions on switch use. I've highlighted in red the software which is open framework, which allows you to put in your own pictures, your own sounds, your own videos, so that the activities that we create are personalised specifically to the student and will help in that motivation process. If you download the booklet that we've talked about, in the back of the booklet I've broken down every single stage that I've talked about and where each piece of software fits in terms of their skills. So you'll certainly be able to use that. And there are lots of software in there. There's lots and lots of software by lots of different suppliers now. So you'll sure that pretty much you'll have lots of those there. I think, Mary, I can move to the next slide.
Our last slide, yeah. There you go.
And that pretty much, I think, is open. I'll quite happily, if anybody has any questions, I'll more than happily answer them in the last few minutes that we have.
And then just so folks know, in order to have a question, we want you to go ahead and chat that so that Ian can read those questions, and then he'll take some time to answer those. And while folks are typing those in, if they have them, Ian, I just want to let folks know that we have had a request to make sure that they get the links to webinar 1 and 2 that are recorded. So I'm going to go ahead in our thank you email and put the actual link in there so people can actually just link directly from their email right into your the recorded sessions from 1 and 2. Okay. And Ian, you're getting a lot of thank yous. Folks have to sign off. It looks like their time is up.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you very, very much for coming along today. I realise that for some people it's very early, for some people it's tea time, and for other people it's lunchtime. Thank you very much for joining. I really do appreciate it. Those links on there will take you to the support page at the bottom, where there's all sorts of information about the switch progression roadmap and a lot of the things that I've been talking about today. You can follow me on Twitter. It's SENICT, and I tweet pretty much 1 million times a day. And you can also join us on Facebook too, where I'll post lots and lots of information, links to websites and things that we can use as well. Thank you very much for joining, and have a wonderful Christmas.
Excellent. And for those of you that are still on the line, if there's any information that you have or need, AbleNet website is there. And then I am Mary Sykes, facilitating the webinar today. You definitely can shoot me an email and I can help you out with any questions that you might have. Also, we do ask for you to go ahead and fill out a survey at the end. So if you would remain on, and I'll shut this down. And Ian, folks are still on the line. So while I bring the survey up, can you answer our last question here from David?
I can. David, external devices such as CD players are a bit of a chore. When we used to use tape recorders, it was quite simple. We plugged the tape recorder into a power link, and by using a power link, we disrupted the power to the tape recorder. The tape recorder stopped, and we could control it. Nowadays, nowadays CD players don't work like that. When we disrupt the power, they go back to standby mode. There are ways to do it. There's a complicated way, and that involves using software such as Switch It Maker, and much better ways to look at a switch-adapted MP3 player, and that's available from Inclusive Technology in the UK and Inclusive TLC in the US, and that will allow you to copy the child's favourite music that you want to control onto a memory stick and plug that into the device, and then you'd be able to use that with up to 3 switches. So one switch would go back a track, the second switch would go forward a track, and one switch would play and pause the music. And that can be used at so many levels too. We can press at an early cause and effect level. We've got latching, so I can put a track, start a piece of music playing, the child can press to stop it and press to start it again. When we're introducing the concept of 2 switches, we can just have 2 switches to experiment with. One switch will change tracks, and the other one will play them. And when we're starting to introduce move and get, so sort of move and choose, I can press the move switch and it will move through the available tracks, and I press the choose switch to be able to listen to them. So yeah, and there are some commercially available CD players from other suppliers in the UK, I think. However, it's my experience that they haven't been very good build quality. I think that's the best way to describe them. And anybody, certainly colleagues that joined us today, would know that if something is going to survive in a special needs classroom, it needs to be fairly robust. So they haven't certainly been very successful in my experience. I hope that answers your question, David.